The US Army has a route clearance problem. Now, I'm sure a lot of you have heard about route clearance. It's where you drive down a road really slow and hopefully find an improvised explosive device before it finds you. But what we have to understand is that route clearance is actually a nuanced idea. And route clearance only became a thing out of necessity back in 2003, where troops were getting taken out left and right from improvised explosive devices in Iraq. And I don't want you to get this confused by clearing routes. US Army combat engineers have been clearing routes for a long time now, but actually implementing route clearance, this is only like a 15-year operation. But everything seems to be coming to an end with this counterterrorism route clearance doctrine of the US Army. You see, a lot of route clearance companies are actually starting to disband and dissolve back into the US Army ranks. They're either going to what's called mechanized combat engineers or light sapper work, where you're running and gunning side by side with infantry. That's what I did. But what we have to realize when you start disbanding combat engineer units who perfected the craft of route clearance, you almost are starting to unlearn what it means to be a route clearance combat engineer and performing the operations of route clearance. And there's a couple of things that's going on. First and foremost, there's not really that big of a need to have dedicated route clearance units. We don't need units to clear entire highways in Afghanistan or to clear entire routes in Iraq, because there's not a lot of deployments going on right now. In fact, there's nearly none. However, all eyeballs are on Russia and Ukraine, and there's something that's going on out there right now. They're doing what's called big military doctrine or big military movements. You see, when I was a combat engineer, we were training for counterterrorism operations, and we were training specifically for Iraq and Afghanistan. And those type of route clearance operations, you're training for looking for garbage in the road, looking for a possible random trash can that'll have an improvised explosive device. But Russia and Ukraine, totally different ballgame. Russia has air capabilities, they have UAVs, they have Overwatch on their landmines. These are different type of dimensions where the US Army combat engineer really did not have to worry too much about. Obviously, there would be ambushes that were initiated by IEDs, but let's be honest, any combat engineer who deployed they never had to worry about an airstrike coming in from the Taliban. But here's where things become even more of an issue. You see, US Army combat engineers, they have to be proficient in everything. And when you start to disband and dissolve combat engineers who are in these route clearance units who have most of their experience from Iraq and Afghanistan, you're starting to lose the trade and you're starting to lose the expertise among the ranks of the Army. Now, personally, I actually think the Army is pinned in a corner of what do we do with these combat engineers, because it actually takes a lot of money to maneuver and maintain these combat engineer units who are route clearance units. These vehicles are massive, they take up a lot of gas, and it takes up a lot of time training the soldiers. They're going to get their training anyway, so we might as well just keep them trained and keep them proficient. And again, I was a former combat engineer, and the engineer community is very small. And having talked to some current combat engineers, they all said the same thing. It's becoming quite difficult to pinpoint what the US Army wants them to even train on. Because when I was working with my friends, we were training on counterterrorism operations and somewhat a little bit of big military doctrine. Now it's totally changing where, hey, we're doing all big military doctrine, and just in case, focus on a little counterterrorism doctrine. And by doing this, you're almost hedging your bets on what the combat engineer might have to do in the next several years in case there is another conflict. But I'm curious what you all think. Do you think it's a great idea to keep disbanding all these units but just keep a little bit of them? Or to totally get rid of route clearance operations and focus on a new military doctrine of route clearance operations?